Hello, in this video you'll learn how to use the Microsoft Agents framework, the new and sometimes a bit too new of a thing that lets you do lots of setups with different AI providers, LLMs, agent development, so lots of different features you have, but in this case we will be looking at a feature that essentially allows you to use LLM models from various providers in one single setup. So you kind of set them up a bit differently, but then you can still reuse it on the same agent depending on your toggles for perhaps different models. Or a very common use case for this would be to simply test how different models work for the same scenario. So there are different use cases. And it works quite well, but again, there are some preview versions and some are not preview versions, so it does get a bit messy. But it's still quite useful because not only you can interchange models, which you can do quite easily without this whole setup, but you can actually interchange providers, which opens up obviously a lot more possibilities in terms of models themselves. To set it up, in this case, we'll be using OpenAI. We'll be using Anthropic's Claude models, essentially. And we'll also use Ollama, which is your local one. And we'll kind of do a little experiment with an interesting prompt to see how they differ. Can they all react the same and all that sort of stuff? Can they follow instructions? So the setup is sort of straightforward and sort of not. The main thing you'll need is microsoft.extensions.ai. So that's the main setup that will kind of use all this other stuff. For all the haiku models, basically Anthropic models, you'll need ai.anthropic. There is another option for Anthropic. Do not use that right now. It might be usable in the future. So something to remember. Because the agents.ai, there is some dependency inside that. They are not matching. The other library is probably a bit more popular, but this is the one you have to use at least for the moment. That's just how it goes. So there's all those versions are matching, and obviously it's all in preview, so that's how it happens. OpenAI, that's in full support. It's good to go. It's not in preview, so that's great. So all your GPT models are in full support. And then for Ollama, your local arrangement, you need Ollama Shop. And of course, you'll need Ollama installed, which is quite easy to do. Just download it and install it. And if you need specific model, you need to go to command line interface and pull it, and it will be available. So relatively straightforward setup there. Now, let's get into the code that we have, a few examples, and let's take a look at the prompt that we'll be using, and then we'll run and compare and look at the actual setup. So for the example setup, we have a system prompt, and then essentially each of the setups will be taking this event brief as a message, and that will be the input, and the output will be the facts for the event. So frequently asked questions for this particular event. Now we have a system prompt with some descriptions. And as you can see, we do the event a bit more complicated, not exactly somewhere simple English names in the United States, something like that. We have some weirder language, perhaps, so English, but still there is that differentiation. So somewhere for it to sort of fall apart. But the more interesting part actually, and this is something you will probably be able quite clearly comparing the results when playing around these sort of lower end models. You see we have this little line, you hate using any numbers, digits, you always write out numbers as words. This isn't also in probably the right place if you really wanted to be strict with a prompt. So it would be in rules, maybe crucial rule it might be. But again, we're not doing a lecture on prompt engineering here. The reason I put it here is so it would be kind of more difficult to figure it out, and we will see a clearer difference between these different models. So these are the system prompt. It will go for each model, and then the event brief is the input message, and we'll get the output for it. Other than that, we have app settings just for the keys, and then we'll have essentially free brains for same agent. We'll get brains essentially will be our chat client. So whatever provider is, and then whatever config for that provider in terms of the actual model. So different uses of that iChatClient interface for different providers, but in the end, whatever you do here, it just depends which one you select. So it will be quite reusable, and that's the main point of it. Now, let's see how you can actually set it up. So for the actual setup for all these providers, let's go one by one. We have, first of all, for Ollama, your local one. Again, there's a little reminder, and this code is accessible in Patreon, and there's some other interesting stuff, some specific courses and things like that. But we have both that, we have that ready, so then we set the model. And what we need to do, we go to Ollama shop. That's one of the NuGet packages we installed for Ollama. Then API client, and then we set it up. We just need the URI, and then we just need the model. It's all local running. There's essentially no security on that. It's what's running on your computer. One thing to note, depending on the hardware you have, you might not even be able to try this properly. It might take forever to actually get a result. It needs sort of, this is a very sort of simple model, but still it needs some relatively decent hardware to actually try it out. And once we look at the results, you'll also see there's a bit of a performance difference between calling a API provider and calling a local one, even though this hardware is quite decent for what it is. So we have a model, and then we return a client, iChatClient. Now, you see all these providers, essentially, they do have in their own setups, whether it be Ollama, whether it be the OpenAI or the preview of Anthropic's, they will all return the same iChatClient interface, and that's what makes it reusable and sort of straightforward to switch between all those things. So the next one is Anthropic's. For this, of course, we need the key, but it beats certainly using an API, direct API access. You can also get a bit of control here. Depending on which version you're using, you can actually get a bit of control. If we go into client, there are some things perhaps, again, it may depend on the version. In the future, it should have a bit of a better support, but you may not actually get all the options that you might have in the raw client. So it's something to consider as well, but it's certainly a lot easier and a lot safer to use this version updates. Not your thing at that point. Someone else is handling that, so it makes it a bit easier, and you only need to provide the key. Of course, always secure the key, always put the limits, and in this case we're just using Haiku model, a simple one. It's gonna be kind of that pattern. One difference is we create Anthropic client, right? We create a client and we need a client, but what we actually need is iChatClient. So we take the client and has a method which will return iChatClient, the same kind of iChatClient that we have with Ollama. The next one, OpenAI, same idea, same exact idea, and it's probably a bit more similar to Anthropic's. We create a client, OpenAI client, we could just call it a client, and return it directly. So it would be almost exactly the same as Anthropic. But in this case, there's a bit of a difference. We create a client and then we again have to get chat client, which then takes a model. So those tiny differences do exist, but in the end, we use SI chat client to get iChat client. That's the main point of it. Now, as for the actual usage, we're still in the same program.cs about the setup. We can toggle. Now, you might have some user input. You might have one model checking the other model. Obviously, with models, you don't need this sort of a setup, this override. But if you have one model from one provider and one from another, then it's always a good thing. And then resiliency and all these sort of things. So it can certainly be used. And in this case, it would run Ollama. It could use the Claude. It could use OpenAI if we uncomment that. We don't have a sort of specific toggle. Or you can set it up so it runs all of them in some sort of an arrangement. But after that, you get the client, the iChat client, as we call it in a fancy way, brain. Perhaps that wasn't the best idea, but that's what we did in this example. So iChat client, and then you create an agent for the client, which will simply take it will take messages. So the agent at that point, all you get from it really is the system prompt setup, all the key setups and things of that nature. So then you only have to provide the message because the system is already set up, right? When we set it up, we have the system prompt, and in the chat client agent here, we have instructions for the system prompt, and then we can reuse this as long as we want, as often as we want, as often as we need to just run with that message that you provide. So message changes, the prompt doesn't, and then you might just have different agents set up with different providers and hence different models. Or you could just set up different iChat clients with same provider but different model, reuse it in that sort of a way as well. So all kinds of options. But that's how it works. And now let's take a look at some results. It is quite interesting because, as I've shown you before, we have this interesting part of the prompt. So if it adheres to the rules, all the years and dates and things should really be in text rather than in numbers. So let's look at all three side by side. So let's first take a look at the loco Ollama, and something to keep in mind at the bottom right away. It took 25 seconds, and again, as mentioned previously, just because you can run something locally doesn't mean you should or you can. It does require a bit of hardware, even something tiny as this model. So the other thing you might notice, we have July 1st, which is July 1. It's not even very nicely written as such. 2026. Then we have 9 to 18. Well, that's a local time. That's okay for the region, but still, we expected to have words as numbers. So if we're moving on and we're taking a look at the GPT-4 Mini, you can now see we have, say, for example, prices, 99. And even going further, we have October 17th, 2026. So it's doing quite a great job to adhering to that rule, which wasn't even sort of explicitly specified. And now we can also compare it to the Anthropic's model. It's got a bit deeper, probably, sort of depth to the answers and to arrangements. And it certainly followed the rules, even probably a bit too much, even the numbers that don't make sense as words, they were turned into words rather than digits. So you see, you can actually compare them. You can compare them side by side. Obviously, console application perhaps isn't the best way to visualize. Outputting it as a file might be better, or creating some sort of Excel table side by side in some of these circumstances might be better. But again, it all depends on the use case. But this is the setup, this is how you can reuse it, and this is how you can set it up in a sort of cleaner way without having to access all the APIs directly. And you get that sort of reusability, at least to some extent. And of course, it's quite interesting to compare how your local model takes forever, 26 seconds, and all the other ones about 5 or 6 seconds, and the result is probably much better. And that said, we will conclude this video.